I don't have that problem anyway. Okay, so
yeah. No, your hair's looking good, Pietro.
Thank you very much. Always. So it's very nice to meet you. Thanks for, contributing to our project. Let me introduce my colleague, Stefania. She will conduct the interview. And we also have another colleague of mine who is dealing with, the video, is Francesco. Sure. I will provide a presentation of the project, and then I will leave the floor to my colleague Stefania. Okay, does it sound like a plan? Okay.
Yeah, that's great. So how long do you think we'll be?
Well, it's really up to you, but I would say half an hour, 35 minutes. Yes. Yeah. 45 minutes at most. Okay.
Well, look, I've got some notes on those questions, and I think some of them are potentially I'll provide a bit more detail than others. But anyway, we'll see how we go. So go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so I think we can start. One more thing. Should I introduce you as the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Institute of Health and Safety? Is that okay?
Correct.
Okay, great. Okay, so I think we can start now. So good morning, everyone. My name is Pietro Manzella. I am a Senior Research Fellow at the Association for International Comparative Studies in the field of labor law and industrial relation. We're having this interview in the context of the research project, Occupational Health and Safety Legislation and Insurance Coverage in the context of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which started in April 2019 and will end in April 2021. The project was commissioned to the Center for International Comparative Studies of the University of Modena and Reggio Emilia, which is based in Italy, and was co-funded by Italy's National Institute for Insurance Against Accidents at Work, INAIL. ADAPT Foundation served as a partner of the project. The main purpose of the research is to study the impact of the changes brought about by the Fourth Industrial Revolution on workers' health and safety, the rapid transition from a physical to a more intellectual dimension of work, the rise of new forms of interaction between man and machine, and the emergence of the new organizational models made possible by new technologies. All of these changes have produced the emergence of new risks, not only physical, but also psychosocial ones. And this research project examines health and safety regulations in new work settings, both in terms of protection and obligation provided by Italian legislation on health and safety at work and workers' insurance. We need to say that the results of the research will be collected in a number of publications, the aim of which is to serve as a sort of guide for occupational health and safety practitioners. Within the research activity, it was also decided to involve experts from other countries in order to deepen our understanding and share the results of the project with those who have been dealing with these issues for a number of years. And to this end, I am delighted to introduce David Clarke. He is a Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Institute of Health and Safety. Welcome, David. He has been involved in this project in order to deal with the issues of the new skills which are needed in order to face emerging risks. I will now leave the floor to my colleague, Stefania. She's also, Stefania Negri, she is an ADAPT Research Fellow who will be conducting the interview. So, Stefania, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Given the complexity of definitions and terminology that characterize the health and safety professionals group and the attempts by the Occupational Health and Safety Professional Capability Framework that has divided health and safety professional into professionals and practitioners. What other strategies can be adapted to better identify this professional group, ensure recognition at the national level and between different countries?
So thanks, Stefania. So look, the first thing is I just want to, maybe I'll provide some Australian context, but also just you referred to the Global Capability Framework. The RHS Professional Global Framework for Practice. From an Australian perspective, that is a critically important document. We have based our certification framework, industry certification framework on it. And I'll talk about that later in response to some of the other questions that you are asking, that I'm aware of that you're asking me. The first thing I'd like to say is the existence of a framework is one thing. The adoption of a framework is another. Now, a tremendous amount of great international work was done to establish that framework. It addresses some long-term complexities and challenges around the diversity and nature of the role of health and safety by distinguishing the knowledge and skills at each of half a dozen levels of health and safety work. And that is very, very important. There are other distinctions that we need to make, but certainly what I would call the vertical distinction within the company between the person who enters the company and is responsible for example, legal compliance and working directly on the line around with workers and making sure that their practices are safe in a very direct and personal way, right up through many levels of the company to the executive level of executive members who lead health, safety and environment. Those roles are incredibly different. They require different skill sets, they require different qualifications, they require different personality types. And the Global Capability Framework is the first document of its kind in the world to actually address that issue. And so in that context, I think it's critically important. The second thing I'd say is, well, what more do we need to do in addition to the framework? We need to get it adopted. So we look at two areas of adoption. Three. I'll address three. The first is industry, business. Why would business adopt it? Business tends to be driven to the march and the sound of its own drum and to profit motive. And there aren't drivers automatically within business for businesses to say, oh, well, let's use the language and the terminology of the Global Capability Framework. The adoption of that language and terminology has a number of knock-on benefits in terms of simplifying and clarifying the way the health and safety function can operate at different levels in the business. But industry is not going to go there unless they're pushed there. So we look at the two other areas. One is the professions themselves, the health and safety profession. I represent the health and safety profession in Australia, and we have gone there. We promote and market the use of the global framework, and we're active talking to recruiters about the terminology. But that's not enough either. The real opportunity for the adoption of this body of work properly within whole countries is through government and through regulatory, health and safety regulatory authorities who themselves are in a position to articulate within their own language, within their own regulations and standards, the terminology that's described in the Global Capability Framework relating to roles. Once they do that, then I think we're going to get somewhere. So that's particularly important. I think the other thing too is that professions ought to be looking at linking their certifications to, and I'll talk about the value of certifications a little bit later, to that global framework. And I think it's through that process that we can also address some of the weaknesses of the global framework. For example, it doesn't address industry specialisation or some of the other narrower specialisations outside the generalist health and safety role, such as auditors, for example, who might have very particular qualifications and skills. So there is a range of things that need to happen in regard to this, but for a start, I'm not sure we need more tools. I think we have an initial tool in the global framework. So the first thing we need to do is use it internationally, and governments need to take that piece of work and build things around it and use the terminology that it provides. And I should say too, it is the first document of its kind in the world that seeks to make common the use of health and safety language between countries. I don't think we can underestimate the value and the power of that in too much. So I don't think we can overestimate it. I think it's very, very important and a tremendous opportunity. And I think if we don't take up that opportunity, I think there will be a real, I think we'll have missed something very, very important.
Thank you. And do you think that current health and safety professionals have the skills to recognize, identify and manage new risks? Such as technological risk, demographic risk, environmental risk, and new occupational disease?
It's an interesting question, especially given COVID-19. So the answer to that is yes and no. Whilst you're asking this question in the context of a project that looks at the changing world, I think we have a pre-existing problem in the field of health and safety. It's not just in Australia, but it's international. And that is the diversity of skill levels and capability levels of people who work within the field of health and safety. Now, there are reasons for this. It's possibly the greatest weakness of the field, this failure to get common language and failure to get consistency of skill levels. In Australia, we have a differential education system, what we call vocational education and training, which is pre-university, and then university level training. Now, within the global framework, that does successfully identify that practitioner level work is often linked to the vocational education and training, and the higher level professional work is linked to the university level work, which is consistent with the terminology of profession. But if one were to utilise, for example, the Australian OHS body of knowledge, which is the best of its kind in the world, the best repository of knowledge on health and safety evidence-based practice in the world today, and is used by Australian universities as the basis for the university level training, one can see that there is a solid basis for the science and practice of health and safety, or if you like, the science, the psychology and the practice of health and safety. The problem is that only a small proportion of the people who work in the field of health and safety actually go to those universities and do those courses. Industry is employing people in significant health and safety roles, and those people do not have the background, the formal education and the skills to carry out some of the basic tasks. So the science and practice of health and safety is there, and those health and safety professionals properly educated and trained in that science and practice are capable of recognising, identifying and managing new risks and in a changing environment. The problem is many health and safety people are not properly educated. And again, that is an international issue. We have the challenge in Australia, and I think it's a widely understood problem internationally. And I think, again, it goes to the nub of the challenge. If we're going to be fit for the purpose of managing rapid environmental, technological and other changes, and being able to identify the new risks that come with them, the gig economy, et cetera, we need to be able to, at least in our toolkit of knowledge and skills, use the existing toolkits that are already there. So From an Australian perspective, I feel that the bases for good education, certainly in the body of knowledge and in our higher education system, are there. My concern is that in Australia, that's only applied to a small percentage of people who work in the field. And overseas, my personal identification is that the problem is worse. So I think what we accept are education standards that are too low in the field of health and safety. There is a solution to that, and that is regulating the capability and knowledge of the profession. But I'll talk about that because I know the question is asked a little bit later. The other thing, of course, is that there are different, I think we need to also recognise that different industries are developed differently. We have what we call the high-risk industries. Mining, for example, and construction, they're two high-risk industries. So from an Australian perspective, I can tell you that the construction industry does better at health and safety than the mining industry. And there is a tendency for the health and safety people who work in construction to work at higher levels of pay, higher executive levels. If you want to know how important health and safety is within any company, any large-scale company, simply look at the position of the highest ranking health and safety person and who it is they report to. If they stand as an executive and report to the chief executive and board, you know that health and safety is considered very significant within that company. So that's an interesting way to diagnose just what the real standing of health and safety is. And I'll give you one other example, and that is in Victoria, and we had our, as you may know, in Australia, we are almost uniquely lucky with COVID-19. We have managed to fully suppress the virus throughout Australia. We have the benefit of being an island nation. People who come to, the only COVID-19 that is appearing in Australia now for many, many months is are people who come from overseas and they go into quarantine, and we manage outbreaks very severely with very severe lockdowns. In the COVID outbreak that did occur in Victoria, where we got up to 850 cases a day, which by international standards is virtually nothing, but in the state of Victoria, it was enough to actually put our healthcare system under strain, a first world healthcare system, supposedly. And I'm very mindful, in Italy, I think there's been, you suffered some of the first of the really serious outbreaks. But what we found was that the healthcare system was not well equipped to manage COVID-19, partly because they had infection control experts and no status for workplace health and safety experts. Now that's an issue because infection control is not good health and safety. Infection control experts do not understand precautionary-based risk management, which goes to this question about people's knowledge and skill and how to manage new and emerging risks. The practice of health and safety, the science and the practice of health and safety is not based on a bunch of standards. It's based on dealing with risk management in a different kind of way, one where when there are unknowns, and with COVID-19 there are many unknowns, what you do is you manage as if some of those unknowns were actually the case, and you mitigate against the risks of those unknowns. Infection control experts ignore things until they're slapped in the face by them. Anyway, I'll stop on that one so we can move on to the next.
Perfect. You anticipated the other questions. And
sorry?
Yes, you anticipated the other questions. What key skills should be possessed by occupational health and safety professionals, and what is the role of soft skills in performing their work? I think it is important, soft skills like hard
Understood.
skills.
Yeah, No, I understand the question. So firstly, what I won't do is begin to repeat what's in the global capability framework. So for the first part of the question, I'll refer you to the global capability framework, which identifies the knowledge and skill requirements at each of those different levels. We support that framework. We were a co-author of that framework. And I think it provides a pretty good description of what not only the knowledge and skill requirements, but the level of mastery of that knowledge and skill. To the issue of soft skills, this is the least well-developed area of capability for health and safety professions in Australia and further afield. Soft skills are critical. For 100 years, researchers within business have been exploring and researching the concept of organisational culture. The concept of organisational culture within the role of the health and safety professional and how to influence that culture is relatively new. It's only been around really for a few years. This notion that health and safety people should actually be influencing whole of organisational culture. The skills that are required to engage in that, I would split into two key areas. One is what I would call business acumen, and the other is soft skills, including the link to emotional intelligence. My concern is that because of the way people tend to enter the field of health and safety, there is a tendency to get people who don't have those skills. So our organisation, for example, is very active right now in trying to retrofit or backskill, reskill our marketplace with the soft skills. And if you can't understand the business, for a start, in terms of understanding the way businesses work, if you can't understand the business, if you can't understand what's driving the chief executive, if you can't understand their concerns, if you can't understand the performance measurements the operational manager of the factory is working to, you cannot talk to them. You certainly can't influence them. And now, once you understand those things, if you cannot then further listen to them and show some of the soft skills, that firstly in listening and being able to absorb what's going on for them, being able to interpret the world through their eyes, which requires emotional intelligence, you can't take the next step, which is equally important, which is influencing that thinking and introducing them to new concepts and ideas. For example, the concept that health and safety is potentially an efficiency measure, not a cost measure. And then there's the technical truth or falsehood of that statement. How you need to understand how to produce health and safety as an efficiency measure as distinct from a cost measure. You can't do that unless you understand what's making the business efficient or how the business is being costed. So we need better business acumen, we need better influencing skills, we need more emotional intelligence amongst our health and safety people. The other knowledge and skill requirements, as I said, are very, very clearly indicated, but my answer to that question is the role of soft skills in performing the work. The higher you are up in the company, the more senior your role, the more critically important soft skills are.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. And many studies point to shortcomings in the methodologies used in training course for occupational health and safety professionals. Do you confirm this trend? What learning methodologies and training courses should be used for this professionals group?
Yes, I'm going to possibly give you a weak answer to this question. The first thing I'll say is that I'm not sure of the studies you're referring to, so I'll just make a general comment. Firstly, in the Australian context, we have a two-tier system. We have the professionals educated at the university level, as I said, and the others educated at the VET level, vocational education and training level. The quality of those systems is vastly different. the type of education in those systems is vastly different. The vet system does not really undertake much at all in the way of assessment. So we can find situations where we have people who have graduated from certain vet courses, and the truth is you can't be sure if they know anything as a result of having done the course. What have they learned? Good question. For people undertaking university studies, you know they're assessed, evaluated, and examined. So we have that as a really significant issue. Now that's within the formal education. You've mentioned training courses. So I will distinguish education from training and talk about people's continuing professional development. In Australia, courses, the system for training offerings in health and safety is completely deregulated and unorganised. There are all sorts of providers in the field. Anybody can just put up their sign out the front of their door and say, I'm a health and safety trainer, and start delivering health and safety training. And many, many people do. The Institute has, for the first time in Australia, decided to implement some kind of quality control mechanism over that by endorsing certain training and not endorsing other training. So we have a completely deregulated system, and the learning methodologies are quite variable. I think ultimately, I'm not familiar with the specific methodologies you're talking about, but I will talk about two emerging methodologies. But I will say the problems we find with a lot of the training that's going on at the moment is the people delivering it aren't suitably qualified. They are simply just declaring themselves to be suitable health and safety trainers, and that's an issue. I will refer to a couple of things though. Online learning is a new development. Automated online learning, accelerated very quickly by the presence of COVID-19. So a learning process without the trainer being present. There are emerging algorithms and technologies that ask the trainee a series of questions and then train them in something slightly different based on their answers. And that's a form of adaptive learning technology, which goes to addressing something that I think is particularly important, and that is what we call unconscious incompetence. In other words, people don't know something and they don't know that they don't know it. So they can't identify it as a potential area for their own training. And if they are taught something along those lines, they'll tend to skip over it unless it's put right in front of their face. So that adaptive learning technology, when you're asking people a series of questions and then altering the training you offer them, ensures that you're not training people in what they already know, but you're focusing on what they don't know. And that is an interesting development and one that we're pursuing. Obviously, VR, virtual reality is an emerging technology. And in Australia, we're finding increasingly good quality training coming out of virtual reality environments, which is putting people on the job in very particular circumstances and learning to understand what, in a visual sense, what risks might really mean. Now, that's probably better for workers themselves and less so for health and safety practitioners and professionals. I probably challenge the question in one sense, except in that I don't really know the context of the question in the form of the studies you refer to. But I will say that if you're talking about training health and safety professionals, health and safety is a science. There are practices that you undertake. You learn how to manage risk in a specific way. You learn about electrical hazards and how to manage them. You learn about psychosocial hazards and how to manage them. You learn about biological hazards and how to manage them. And the methodology is a learned methodology. You learn about the psychology of people's thinking and how to manage that. You learn about the influence of you learn about the behaviour of groups versus the behaviour of individuals. You learn about all of those basic sort of things. These things are not complex concepts in the sense of, they're not new. They are part of the sciences and psychology. They already pre-exist. People learn about them. The question is, if you need to teach them at a university level if you're serious. It's university level learning. In Australia, there are some people who like to say health and safety is really simple. Well, it's not. It's a science. And it needs to be taught like a science. And people shouldn't be practicing it unless they've qualified themselves in that science. And that's our structural problem.
Thanks a lot. And the last question, do you think it is useful to certify the skills of these professionals? What other qualification system do you think should be adapted to better define the job of these professionals group?
Yes, so health and safety people who work in companies, particularly high-risk industries, actually have the lives of people in their hands. If they behave in a certain way or don't do certain things, it is possible that ultimately people will die. And yet, we do not test the capability of these people in a formal sense. The government of Australia does not require people to demonstrate their capability through a certification framework. And the government does not regulate that it is a requirement for a business to take on a suitably qualified and certified health and safety practitioner or professional. So the answer to that question is, it's not useful to certify the skills of professionals. It's critical to certify the skills of professionals if we're going to really properly improve health and safety. If you're going to make a leap, if you're going to leap into the future, if this project really is about taking the country to that future and dealing with the challenges of that future, then an investment must be made in certifying capability. What do I mean by capability? Well, it's not knowledge and it's not competency. Competency is usually an assessment on the job. Knowledge is something that's usually assessed as a result of an education process. Capability is the combination of education and then work experience, and then having a person demonstrate that they understand how to apply the conceptual ideas that they were educated in the real world, in the workplace, through experience, and then become suitably certified. That is the pathway that works for a number of critical professions. And I, for one, and the Australian Institute of Health and Safety, believe very strongly that this is the next stage. If we look at what we define as a health and safety profession internationally, I see an adolescent profession, an immature profession. And this is one of the ways in which the profession is immature. It is a critical role. It involves the lives of people are at stake. And for a role which has the lives of workers at stake, it is the most unregulated role in the world, in my opinion. We have businesses that are regulated, but the people who are advising those businesses and showing those businesses how to do the work, either as direct employers or as consultants, must be seen to be suitably qualified if we're going to have confidence for the business that they're getting the right advice. So I think that's particularly important, and I think governments should legislate to drive a certification framework for the profession. I think it's really critically important for both consultants and for people who work in the field. Now, I would also add to that certification frameworks, by definition, don't just involve the entry point. where a person demonstrates that they are suitably educated and then they are suitably experienced and skilled on the job. It also involves lifelong learning. And so a certification framework can also embrace the problem we just talked about, which is training. So a suitable continuing professional development framework that involves giving people access to the right kinds of training, properly delivered, allows a stronger control over not just the education entry point to the work of the health and safety person, and not just the on-the-job, ongoing work, but their lifelong learning journey where they become more and more capable over a period of time. And if we can put those things in place, we can certainly have a more mature profession internationally. And we can be more confident that the people who work in those roles are better equipped to deal with 21st century issues.
Thanks. I would like to thank David for his contribution to our project, which will benefit a lot from his insight. And thanks a lot, and take care.
Okay, no problem. Thanks very much, Stefania. We'll hear from you.
Bye. See you soon.
Okay,
another project, probably.
Take good care.